more locally, more intimately, and that the idea that you could drive reform of the system we have at that meta level and actually get all these large companies to, let's just say, I'm not saying this is necessarily the be-all and end-all, but to switch to organic, that wouldn't satisfy us. And so I think that's a question to ask yourself. But to me, that points to the fact that we are interested in these more social, cultural dimensions of food, and not just getting the pesticides out and even paying a fair wage. I think that the people drawn to this movement are looking for something more profound.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
I agree. Shockingly, I agree. You said something about the call for the national food policy being perhaps naive, and in retrospect, I don't know what we expected. I don't know if we talked about what we expected. We talked about what we hoped might happen. And one of our drafts went to the White House, and things, it was noticed, but as you've all noticed, nothing really has happened. I mean, we're still having the conversation. But there is this bigger conversation about whether, if our document had been taken to heart, and if a national food policy of the kinds we were talking about were instituted 2 years from now, it really would change everything, which kind of makes it impossible, because it makes it revolutionary, because it would have affected, we would have, we wouldn't even be discussing a $15 minimum wage. We'd be discussing a $25 minimum wage. We'd be discussing things that are basically, we'd be discussing reshaping Iowa. We'd be discussing really
big
huge,
stuff. Yeah.
big stuff. So it kind of goes back to, revolution versus reform questions, which are questions that have been happening for 200 years among movement builders, among people who want to change society. And then you get to this place where you say, well, we can look at the super big picture and probably be frustrated for most of our lives, or we can look at parts of the big picture and try to find solutions. I'm not saying we would work on a campaign to make McDonald's organic, but when McDonald's announces that it's going to go to antibiotic-free chicken, this is a victory for us, whether we want it to be one or not. It is a victory for us. So I think one of the things we wanted to get to, and I think this is an okay transition to that, is what do we think are the winnable, and believe me, Michael and I I don't think have all the answers to this. What do we think are the winnable, smart, addressable issues for right now? Not the issues that are going to change everything, recreate the food system immediately, but the things that that can be addressed by activists and by journalists and by students and researchers and by principled people, NGOs everywhere, that we might be able to move on soon, that would really show us that we can have bigger victories than the things that McDonald's chooses to do. So,
yeah, well, I think these corporate victories are important, and I do think, I think we tend to trivialize the importance of consumer politics, and I know we can't shop our way to salvation, as you often hear, whether it's about climate change or food. But in an era where corporate power is largely unchecked, consumer power is very important. And a lot of the progress we have seen has come from people voting with their forks for different kinds of food, and people organizing as consumers to boycott companies. I think one of the most successful political initiatives in this movement, which you'll see a lot of if you go see that film, which I highly recommend, Food Chains, is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers kind of invented a new way to do labor politics. And it's a new way to do labor politics that's very much suited to an era where the government is not going to help labor very much, and that face-to-face negotiations with corporations don't work very well. And so just to summarize what they did, and what's so creative about it, is this is the tomato pickers in Florida, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and they tried everything to get the attention of the big packers, they're called. These are the people who grow all the tomatoes that are eaten in America for several months of the year. And they got nowhere. They had a hunger strike. They got nowhere. They could not get the attention of these companies even to sit down. They marched across the state of Florida. They got nowhere. And as Lucas Benitez described it to me, he said, we were banging on the walls of the castle and they didn't even hear us. And then we found this door. And the door was the brands of the large companies that buy from those packers you've never heard of. Burger King, Pizza Hut, Walmart, all these companies. And they came up with this idea, which was they created a pledge, a fair food agreement, which stipulated what they wanted, a penny more per pound for their workers and no more slavery. I mean, these were not high-level demands, but minimal and important demands. And various other worker rights. And then they essentially shamed those companies into signing that agreement. And they did this through boycotts and marches and protests and organized consumer activity. So I think one of the Achilles heel of the system we're in is the preciousness of consumer brands to companies. And they will do anything to defend them. And some environmental groups are starting to figure this out. And I think it does offer a path on various issues. So, we need a new politics for a new moment and a new kind of issue. And I think the coalition kind of showed the way on for attacking a certain kind of issue, not everything, but the ones where there are important brands implicated. And I think that's why you see McDonald's moving now. They want to look more progressive, more like Chipotle. And that these corporations are very powerful, but they're also very weak. They're really vulnerable. They're terrified of you. They really are. They're terrified of their consumer because they've seen their consumer kind of move on a dime over pink slime, over, food fads and food fears. And that power, I think, and they're more afraid of the food movement than they really should be, but they really are. And that fear is something that could be exploited politically, I think.
Well, then the question remains how to do that, because Coalition of Immokalee Workers' victory was 5, 7. I mean, it's ongoing.
No, it's ongoing.
Because
they just got Walmart to sign on.
It is
that was
ongoing,
a huge
and it is ongoing, but it hasn't been repeated. And that was very much of a ground-up operation.
Right.
And we haven't seen it in other industries until now. And now we're seeing fast food workers doing a very similar thing. And for those of you who've been following this, the Fight for 15 was initiated largely by fast food workers. But now there are hospital workers involved, there are retail workers involved, there are domestic workers involved, there are child care workers involved, there are minimum wage workers all over the country involved. And we've seen successes on a municipal level in many cities. We haven't seen successes on a state level, although minimum wage has gone up in a few states, but quite minimally. And we certainly haven't seen success on a national level, but we have seen movements, and we have seen the beginnings of organizations, and these don't resemble, they're affiliated with traditional labor unions, but they don't resemble traditional labor unions because they're not organized by craft, they're organized basically by income at this point. And we are starting to see some movement in that. The questions remain, how do we help those things, and how do we get those kind of movements around other issues that we see as important in food? And I would like to raise the antibiotic issue, because when I started writing the Times opinion column, which is going on 5 years ago, I felt like we were this close to winning on antibiotics. Obviously, I was wrong. But I was quite hopeful at that point, and I remain hopeful. I think it's the single easiest or clearest victory we can have. And yet, we haven't had it. We're relying on voluntary guidelines from FDA, which are, not to put too fine a point on it, pathetic. And we're relying on the good graces of companies like Chipotle and Panera, who from the get-go said we're not buying meat with antibiotics in them, and have, as Michael just said, have shamed companies like McDonald's into at least moving off the dime. Which no doubt FDA would say this is a success because we've encouraged this kind of behavior. But without getting too wonky, superbugs, antibiotic-resistant bacteria killed 23,000 or some number of people like that last year. That number is growing, and antibiotics are continually becoming less effective, and this is directly associated with antibiotic use in raising animals. When I addressed this, I actually got access to the White House on this issue also, and when I tried to address this at the White House and said superbugs are multiplying, antibiotics aren't working, and so on, I was told it was under control because the Department of Homeland Security was working on it, and we were going to make stronger antibiotics. That's like building a bigger nuclear weapon. But you have more.
Issue. I mean,